Hey guys, this is Benny Ricciardi with rotocurve.com, and I'm here during the All-Star break with some of the teaching videos that we're going to bring you guys. We had a couple questions that have been asked many times over and over in our chat. So what we decided to do is put together a couple videos that answer some of the most commonly heard questions that we get while we're over in chat. So the one that we're going to be discussing today is about GPP strategies and things that you can do to help yourself have a chance to win a large pool tournament. So like always, we put together a little bit of a slideshow. So let me call that up and we'll get into the particulars of it all. This is our NBA GPP strategy slideshow. And there's 4 things we're going to be talking about. Where does it make the most sense to pay up? Which players, which positions, things like that. Why do you fade players? And what's the reason for doing it? Where's the upside? How can it help you win money, basically? The difference between being contrarian and being stupid, which I think is something that a lot of people still don't really understand. And the last thing we're going to talk about is game stacking. How do you game stack? Why do you game stack? And, what's the upside and what's the point of doing it? So the first thing we're going to talk about is where do you pay up? Basically, there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. And again, every slate is going to be different. Sometimes on the smaller slates, it's a lot harder to swerve off of certain players. On the smaller slates, I tend to see myself going a lot more stars and scrubs, mostly because the available options that you have when you come off of a high price player aren't always guys that are going to, get you anywhere near the value or the upside that the guy, the high price player can. So it winds up pigeonholing you into certain guys, which is why you guys might hear me say sometimes I'm not a huge fan of playing some of the smaller slates. I like when you have, probably at least a 7 to 10 team slate, 6 to 8 team, maybe somewhere in there is, probably where I think is the best spot for me. Point guards are one spot that I do tend to pay up for, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Point guards are the only ones that really rack up, double-digit assists or close to it. And what most people don't realize is assists are actually worth more than rebounds on just about every fantasy site. On most sites, assists are worth 1.5 points, where rebounds are only 1.25. You also tend to get a lot of steals from point guards. They're usually the ones that get there. And most point guards will even grab the occasional rebound or two to go along with some scoring. On a site like DraftKings, where you get a 3-point bonus, guys that can shoot well always get a little bit of a boost. It's part of the reason why Steph Curry always has some absolutely eye-popping numbers when he has one of those games where he hits a lot of threes and, racks up a bunch of assists. So for me, I definitely like paying up at the point guard spot. I think something that people don't do often enough over on FanDuel is pay up for 2 point guards. It seems that a lot of people try to, go and find that cheap value guy. But, there are times when paying up for 2 of the top studs, which is something that, again, if other people aren't doing it, it's something that you're getting at low ownership. And that's really what you need if you're trying to get the upside to win a tournament. 2 of the other positions I tend to pay up for are power forward and centers, especially on DraftKings due to the fact that they can get you that double-double bonus. But also power forwards and centers are usually more likely to rack up the blocks for you, obviously depending on which guys you use. There are certain guys that block shots, certain guys that don't. So this doesn't apply to everybody. But again, we don't need to play everybody. We just need to pick out 1 or 2 of the best guys that we want and roll them out there and play. Whenever I'm playing on DraftKings, I usually wind up using a second point guard in the guard spot, usually wind up using a second power forward in the forward spot, and I usually wind up with a second center or a third point guard in the utility spot, basically because I think that those are the positions where you can usually find the most upside for the price. Very rarely do I wind up with more than 1 shooting guard on my roster, and the reason for that is most shooting guards are one category scoring dependent. And what that means is, a lot of shooting guards don't rack up assists. They don't get a ton of rebounds for you. Maybe they get some steals. Not too many of them block a lot of shots. Really, the shooting guard comes down to, did they score 20 or 25 real-life points or did they not? And the games where they don't and they have a 10 or 12-point game, those are the games where we usually see them underperform. That's why I think that that's a position where you can actually go cheap. Get a guy who's $4,000 or $5,000 on DraftKings or FanDuel, and, pretty much have a solid chance to get 20 to 30 points out of them, which is really all you need for value. So I think there's a lot of guys that are in those spots that you can look at, which is one of the reasons why I don't usually pay up for shooting guard. Small forwards do tend to do a little bit of everything across the board in all categories. So to me, they're different than shooting guards. But the thing about small forwards is, basically every small forward tends to do a little bit of everything across the board. They're all going to score a couple points for you. They're all going to grab a couple rebounds for you. They all may rack up some assists. They're usually good defensive players, so you get some steals and blocks from them. And I really don't think that there's a huge difference between paying up for some guys and going down to some others. The next thing we're going to talk about is why do you fade players? As you can see by the picture over here, it says get back in the box and start thinking like the rest of us. If you want to win some of these GPPs, you need to learn how to think outside the box. Fading players is a strategy that you're really only going to use for tournaments. You know, I hear people say, well, I'm fading them in my cash games. And if you're fading people in your cash games, then you don't understand the idea of cash games or fading. The idea of fading somebody in a tournament is not to use a guy who you think is going to be highly owned. And the hope is that you can find somebody that can outscore him, or that you can get a guy who can give you really good value and then allow you to spend up elsewhere. So if everybody's spending up for, you know, James Harden and he only goes for 45 fantasy points, you don't have to find another guy who gets 46 or 47 to get ahead of Harden. But if you have a cheap guy in there who gets, say, 30 fantasy points for $4,000, you know, you're going to be ahead of the pace that the guy with Harden is on your overall roster. Now you might have been able to spend up $10,000 for a guy like Boogie Cousins since you didn't take Harden, whereas the guy who took Harden now only has a $4,000 player that he's going to need to match the 30 that you got out of your player in order to get you to the top of a tournament. Now, if it's one of those days where Harden was 40 or 50% owned and he underperforms that way, you know, if he's 50% owned in a 50-50 and has a bad game, you know, just by fading him, you know, for a tournament, you're probably putting yourself in the top half of the field. And that means that it's a lot easier for you to get into that top 20% of the field where you can really get a cash, or into the top 1 or 2% of that field and get a big cash. Many rosters that pay up for a lot of the chalk plays and some of the chalk value guys will all look the same. So, excuse me, on a day where there's a, you know, maybe a chalk value center and a chalk value small forward, and everybody loves James Harden, well, that's 3 spots in everybody's roster that are going to be the same. So the amount of money you have left over and the guys that are available to you to fill out the rest of your roster, you're going to have the same amount of money as a lot of other people. And if they're doing the same homework that you are, you're all probably going to wind up on, you know, the same group of players. Sure, 1 or 2 guys might be different, but there's going to be a lot of overlap where, you know, the difference between you coming in a big cash or just a minimum cash could be the difference between like 1 or 2 guys on your roster. Whereas if you decide to, you know, fade one of the big chalk plays, your entire roster construction could be different. Instead of spending $10,000 on a shooting guard like we did in the example above with Harden, if we would have came down and spent, say, $4,600 or $4,800 on a guy like Jamal Crawford, well, now we have extra money to spend on other positions. So where everybody else might only have $5,000 or $6,000 available at the other positions, you know, and have to look for guys that are $6K or below, we might have $7K per position available. So we're looking at a whole different set or a whole different caliber of guys than they are. So a lot of the other guys that are going to be highly owned because they fit in with that big stud that everybody's playing today, you know, you might wind up being able to get a better option than them and wind up getting a couple guys that are low owned. And that's really the way to win like a large field tournament. So it definitely makes sense to go away from the grain. But the thing that I want people to understand is, you know, and we'll get into it in the next clip, is there's a way to be contrarian without being stupid. And that's what we want to talk about here. You know, when everybody else is zigging, you want to zag. But you don't need to do it at every spot on your roster. You know, every player that's highly owned is not somebody you need to fade. If there's 4 or 5 standout guys that you think everyone's going to be using on a day, you know, you don't want to not use any of those 5 guys just to be contrarian. Those 5 guys are probably the ones that everyone's using because those are the guys that are in the best spot. Sure, 1 or 2 of them may underperform, but to ask all 5 of them underperform is probably asking a lot. So just because you want to be contrarian doesn't mean you have to fade everybody. You know, you can do it by fading 1 or 2 players that everybody else has, and, you know, that'll allow you to have a different amount of money than everybody else has to fill out the last 3 spots. And you should be able to get enough differentiation in your roster with those 4 or 5 different positions that you're floating around, and also by not using 1 or 2 of the highly owned plays. Now, in order to be contrarian without being stupid, the first thing you need to do is figure out who the chalk plays are going to be. And what I like to do is, you know, if you have a guy like James Harden who's $10,000 and you think he's going to be the chalk, well, that now opens up 2 things for me. That means that shooting guard is going to be a spot where you can find some low-owned plays because if everyone's using Harden, everybody else is going to be lower owned. The other thing it shows me is that, you know, if everyone's using $10,000 to pay up for Harden, other guys that are priced around that $10,000 range are probably going to be better plays at low ownership because less people are going to be on them in the tournament. Let's face it, we all want to pay up for all these $10,000 guys every day, but you can't really round out a roster with more than maybe 2 of them. So if everyone's paying up for Harden and then going in the 6 and 7K range to round out their roster, if you pay up for two different 10K guys, not including Harden, there's a good chance that one or both of those guys is going to be lower owned than he normally should be or would be on any other slate that you play in. One thing I like to do is, I like to look for guys that are still in good matchups that are flying under the radar. So, even though Harden might be the top matchup on the day, say going up against the Sacramento Kings and their horrible shooting guard defense, it doesn't mean that, LeBron isn't also in a good spot. And LeBron could just as easily put up 60 points, especially if Harden has a bad game and only puts up like 40 or 45. So in that situation, you're being contrarian without being stupid because you're not taking a guy who's in a bad matchup. At the same time, you may have somebody going up against the Utah Jazz or the San Antonio Spurs who's also in the same price range. Now, we know that the Spurs and the Jazz are two teams that we do not want to target guys against. So playing a guy like that in a bad matchup still makes him a bad play. And that's being stupid, not being contrarian. Yeah, I know nobody wants to play James Harden against the San Antonio Spurs. Well, you know what? There's a reason why nobody wants to play James Harden against the San Antonio Spurs, because it's not smart to pay $10,000 for him there. So the guys that you want to look for are guys that still make sense, guys that still could have a big game or still should have a big game, but people are overlooking because there's a, shinier object that is drawing everyone's attention. It works a lot as well in like the 6 and 7K range. There could be a guy that everybody in the world is talking about today and everyone thinks is cheap. Well, if you swerve to one of the other guys that's above or below him, that's still in a good spot as well, but, is maybe $100 more or $100 less, where the average person in that spot is going to be drawn to the big name or the big shiny object of the day, you could wind up getting some of those guys at fraction of the ownership. The chalk guy could be 40, 50%, and the guy that you're getting could be 6% or 8%, where if he goes off and has, the same 35 or 40 fantasy points, if he has 40 and the guy everybody else uses has 28, you're going to put yourself in a really good situation at the top of a tournament, with 40% of the field beat and less than 8% of the other people having the same guy as you do. And that's a way for you to be contrarian without being stupid and have it pay off and help you win a big tournament. The last thing we're going to talk about is the idea of game stacking and how and why you do it. For GPPs especially, I think it's something that people don't do often enough. GPPs are a great place to take a stud from each of the two teams that are playing in a game, or maybe two or three of the value guys and one of the studs from each side of the game. If it's a high-scoring game, if it goes into overtime maybe, the upside that you have by having a big amount of exposure to one game is enormous. And really, upside is what we're looking for in tournaments. We don't care about min cashing or coming in the top 50%. We don't even really care about, coming in the top 20%. When you're playing in these big field tournaments, you want to be in the top 1 or 2% where you don't just get double your money back. You get 10 times your money. You get 15 times your money. You get, 100 times your money, or $100,000, $50,000 grand prize. That's really what we want. And in order to do that, like I said, you're going to have to take some chances. You're going to have to look for upside. And again, one of the best ways to get upside is when a game goes to overtime. Also if a game winds up having like just an absolutely breakneck, ridiculous pace where the final score ends up 122 to 117 or something like that. If you have 3 or 4 guys in that game, you're also going to be sitting pretty. So that's the idea of game stacking. That's why you do it and, basically how you do it. One of my favorite ways to game stack, one of my favorite GPP roster construction techniques is to stack some guys from each team and finish it off with the top value plays on the day. One that sticks out to me, I remember earlier in the year, I think there was a game where Houston played Washington, and you could have stacked a guy like, James Harden and John Wall together, and then thrown in some of the guys like Brewer or Josh Smith or Ariza or Beverly. And then on the other side of the game, thrown in, somebody like an Otto Porter or a Gortat. And then there were 2 or 3 like obvious value plays, situations where like I think it was maybe like a Devin Booker starting at min price or something like that. So if you take some of those top value plays on the day and you throw them in there with the game stack around it, if those value plays do what they do and that game does happen to be the one that goes off for, a high score or an overtime, there's a good chance that you're going to wind up with one of those big 300 to 350 scores on, DraftKings or FanDuel that actually give you a chance to take down more than just a minimum cash in some of these GPPs. So those are some of my thoughts on, ways that you can improve your GPP game. Obviously it's a part of the game that everybody wishes was better because, it's the part that can turn $20 into, 5 or 10,000 or $100 into 100,000 or something like that. So there's a lot of strategies that you can use. These are just some of the ones that I'm throwing out there. as always, feel free to, send me a message on Twitter. You can send a message to me at BennyR11 or over at RotoCurve, or make sure to hang out in the chat. If you have any questions about this stuff, I'll be, more than happy to give you my thoughts on it. There's a million different ways to do it. You can listen to, 10 or 20 really good players who all have their own strategies, but, these are some of the ones that have worked for me. So with so many people asking the questions, I wanted to kind of put the video together to show you guys, some of my thought process and some of the ways that I go about building my rosters. So, hopefully you can build some rosters that bring in some big scores for you as well. So thanks again for joining us here at rotocurve.com. And as always, stay classy, DFS.